All right, welcome back, everyone. It's time to plunge back into the JFK files.
Back into the rabbit hole we go.
You know it. It's hard to believe this is our fifth deep dive already into this latest batch of declassified documents from March 18th of this year, 2025.
Yeah, time flies when you're sifting through thousands of pages of history, huh?
You can say that again. And thanks to our friends at Bald and Bonkers Network, LLC, we're making good headway on our mission, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. To remind our listeners, that mission is to uncover any and every little detail hidden in these files that could shed light on JFK's assassination.
That's right. And with today's deep dive, we'll hit a pretty big milestone. We'll have combed through 100 of these files.
100 down, over 1,000 to go.
It's a massive undertaking, but we're up to the task. Now, you've got another hefty stack of documents in front of you today, right?
Oh yeah, a whole 20 files this time. They are, for the record, files 104, 10065, 10035, 10386.pdf, 104, 10065, 10386.pdf, 104, 1066, 1000326.pdf, 104, 1006, 1066, 10006.pdf, 104, 10066, 1006, 1007.pdf, 104, 10006, 1066, 1006.pdf, 104, 1006, 1003 text.pdf, 104, 1066, 1004.pdf, 104, 1066, 1067, 1043.pdf, 104, 100067, 100060.pdf, 104, 100668, 100002.pdf, 104, 100065, 100066.pdf, 104, 1000, 10065, 100065, 10358.pdf. So where do we even begin?
Well, let's dive into a document from July 16th, 1968. It might not directly address the JFK assassination, but it gives us a peek into the investigative climate at the time. This one concerns a U.S. House of Representatives Select Committee on Assassinations. He was, of course, convicted of killing Dr. King. These leads take them to Portugal, the UK, and Mexico.
So they were casting a wide net, huh?
It seems so. Their focus on these locations stemmed from intel, suggesting that Ray was in Lisbon back in May of '68, right before he was nabbed in London in June.
Hold on a second. So we've got a congressional committee, right? Actively pursuing international leads on another major assassination, and this is happening just a few years after Kennedy's death.
Precisely. It's a reminder that these events weren't happening in isolation. There was a lot going on, a lot of investigations unfolding simultaneously. This memo specifically mentions Mr. G. Robert Blakey. He was the chief counsel and staff director for the committee.
Blakey, that name rings a bell.
Well, he was quite keen on building a, cordial relationship with the Portuguese National Police. He hoped to gain their cooperation, including access to their files and the opportunity to interview any potential witnesses who could shed light on Ray's time in Lisbon.
Wow, they were really going for it, huh? Asking for access to foreign police files? That's no small feat.
It really highlights the complexities of international investigations, especially when you're dealing with something as sensitive as an assassination. And there's more. The memo also indicates that the State Department was brought in on this.
What was their role in this?
Well, they were asked to advise on the best way for Blakey to approach the Portuguese authorities. The memo even instructs them to avoid involving station officers in direct negotiations unless absolutely necessary, to protect their cover.
That's interesting. So even in the midst of investigating a major assassination, they're still super concerned about operational security. It speaks volumes about the priorities at play.
It really underscores the delicate balancing act between pursuing these investigations and maintaining the integrity of ongoing intelligence operations. You see this tension play out again and again in these declassified files. It gives you a glimpse into the challenges the agency faced in this era.
All right, let's move on to a secret memorandum dated September 20th, 1966, titled Operation Escalade. Now, this sounds like we're stepping into some pretty clandestine territory.
It certainly does. This memo refers to a folder of sensitive materials associated with Operation Escalade. What's intriguing here is that this material isn't classified as CS, meaning it wasn't considered overt clandestine service material. Yet it's deemed sensitive enough to be retired under what they call black tape wrapping and given a specific job number, V78678.
Black tape wrapping sounds intense.
And there's more. The distribution of this folder was extremely limited.
Who had access to this information?
Well, the memo outlines that access was restricted to the offices of the DCI, that's the Director of Central Intelligence, of course the DDCI, Deputy Director of Central Intelligence, the DDP, Deputy Director for Plans, and several components within the Directorate of Plans. We're talking CWH, likely the Western Hemisphere Division, CWHPL, probably planning within that division, CWHC, maybe covert action within the Western Hemisphere. And then you have CCI, counterintelligence, CTSD, Technical Services Division, later became OTS, the Director for Security, and the General Counsel. Quite a lineup.
Wow, that is a very select group, very high-level folks. When we're looking for connections to JFK, this limited access really makes you think, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And what's even more telling is who wasn't given access. The memo explicitly mentions that China Operations was neither an originator, an addressee, nor even an information recipient for these sensitive Operation Escalade materials.
So whatever Escalade entailed, it was completely separate from anything happening in China.
Seems that way.
Okay.
And it was clearly considered highly sensitive, restricted to a very specific group within the agency leadership. Now, this memo doesn't directly link Escalade to JFK, but the level of secrecy surrounding it certainly raises questions.
You can't help but wonder what else might be hidden in the files, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There could be more closely held secrets waiting to be uncovered. Okay, shifting gears a bit, we have another secret memorandum, this one dated July 3rd, 1974. It's titled OTS, late TSD, and Jim McCord's Cuban Activities. Now, Jim McCord, that name should be familiar to our listeners.
Yeah, wasn't he a major player in the Watergate scandal?
The one and only. This memo explores a potential connection between McCord and certain activities in Cuba. It's examined through the lens of the Office of Technical Services, or OTS, which was previously known as the Technical Services Division, or TSD.
Okay, so we're talking about the technical side of things.
Exactly. The memo recounts a conversation with someone named Ben Calling. He states that one of the individuals who had been jailed in connection with these Cuban activities had been released. This individual apparently inquired about McCord's involvement, but found no indication that he was ever part of it.
So someone directly involved in these activities didn't know about McCord. That seems to suggest he wasn't involved, right?
Well, not necessarily. The memo then raises a very interesting point. It speculates that this fellow in jail might not have been aware of McCord's involvement, or if McCord was involved, his role might have been restricted to planning at headquarters, without any actual deployment to the field.
So they're considering a scenario where McCord's involvement, if any, was more strategic, behind the scenes.
Precisely. And it gets more interesting. The memo's author points out that the security personnel working with TSD at the time were responsible for hand-holding with the families of the three men involved in these Cuban activities.
Hand-holding, so like keeping them informed, reassured?
That's the idea. The author suggests that there might be TSD records of this interaction with the families, which could lead to someone who might know about McCord's possible involvement in the planning stages.
It sounds like they're digging for any possible connection, even years later.
It demonstrates the agency's ongoing efforts to piece together the full scope of past operations, especially when someone like McCord, with his, later notoriety, is potentially linked. The memo mentions that Calling was actually pulled out of a staff meeting for this conversation and said he'd call back later. We don't see a follow-up in this document, but it shows their willingness to pursue even the slightest leads related to past Cuban operations, especially when a figure like McCord is in the mix.
Right, because his later involvement in Watergate would have made anything he was connected to that much more sensitive.
Exactly. They were trying to piece together their own history, retrospectively, and McCord's later actions would have been a huge factor in that.
Okay, let's rewind the clock a bit now. We've got a secret memorandum from September 20th, 1960. It's titled, Summary of Escalade Audio Operation Against the New China News Agency in Havana. It looks like Operation Escalade makes another appearance, but this time we're getting some context.
So this is where we finally get to see what Escalade was all about.
This memo lays it out. It describes an audio surveillance operation targeting the New China News Agency, or NCNA, office in Havana. The operation started in May 1959, soon after the NCNA set up shop there. Their office included both workspaces and residential apartments.
So they were spying on the Chinese news agency right in the heart of Cuba. Bold move.
It was the height of the Cold War, remember? The memo states that the station got the green light from the U.S. ambassador and an embassy employee named Carolyn C. Stacy to install a microphone and tape recorder in the adjacent apartment. Basically, they were listening through the wall.
Talk about being right under their noses. Right. By November 59, the Far East, or FE Division, sent a case officer and a TSD technician to Havana. They completed the installation into Stacy's apartment. But by June 1960, there were concerns that the NCNA might be using other rooms in their building for communications equipment. They needed to expand their surveillance.
So they felt the need to, Escalate their efforts. Pun intended, given the operation's name.
Exactly. A FE division case officer named Brian Mills went down to Havana and managed to lease an apartment directly above the NCNA office. He even set things up for a TSD operative to stay in that apartment, 247, to monitor the audio feed.
Sounds like they were pulling out all the stops for this operation. What happened once they had this expanded setup in place?
In August 60, a TSD technician team was sent to Havana as part of another operation, this one under the SR division. Their job was to install the new equipment needed for the NCNA operation in that upstairs apartment. A second FE Division case officer, Robert Neal, joined them, and together they installed a probe microphone and a tape recorder in that apartment. Things seemed to be going smoothly.
Sounds like they had everything in place to get the intel they wanted. But this memo takes a bit of a turn, doesn't it?
It does. Around midnight on September 14th, the technicians were working in Neal's apartment, probably finalizing the installation. Then, at 1 a.m. on September 15th, an embassy secretary named Lennox enters his own apartment and, surprise, he gets searched by Cuban authorities.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, not good. Later that day at 3:40 p.m., Neal, the stay-behind agent, and his wife are picked up by Cuban authorities and detained.
And what about the technicians?
They didn't escape either.
Yeah.
All 3 TST technicians were apprehended by Cuban authorities. The memo, dated September 20th, 1960, states that Neal was still in custody. Lennox and his wife had been released and were back in Washington. But the 3 technicians remained in custody. An embassy officer had briefly seen them, but hadn't been able to speak to them directly. This was clearly a major blow to the agency's operations in Havana.
A big setback, for sure. The memo also mentions how the Cuban press reported this incident. What was their take on it?
Well, according to articles in Cuban newspapers, the 3 technicians were arrested while in the apartment above the NCNA office, in the process of installing the surveillance equipment. The press claimed that a key to Mrs. Lennox's apartment was found on one of the technicians, and that he had identified that apartment as his own. It's important to note that all the Cuban press releases referred to the men using aliases. They never mentioned their affiliation with the U.S. government or the agency.
So they were trying to protect their identities, at least publicly.
It seems so. Initial reports suggested that the men would be charged with espionage against the people of China, which is a pretty serious charge.
Definitely. So what happened next? What efforts were made to help these guys?
Consul Hugh Kessler tried to contact the men on September 17th, but he was unsuccessful. He was just told they were in custody. The memo also details the cover story used for the technicians. They had entered Cuba posing as tourists under what they called very light commercial cover. They used a cover company that provided things like telephone answering and mail pickup services. They were also given fake home addresses to use when entering and leaving Cuba. Interestingly enough, later inquiries revealed that individuals using those fake names had actually lived at those addresses, at least partially confirming their cover story.
So their cover wasn't completely bogus. That's pretty smart.
Right. And the memo also highlights the concern for the families of the technicians. One technician's father was very ill and had been contacted by the Office of Security. The wives of the other 2 were being contacted at least daily by TSD staff to keep them updated. They even had a meeting with the 2 wives on September 19th to discuss the situation. On top of that, a law firm in New York had been briefed on the situation and was ready to handle any inquiries that came through the cover company. This whole episode really illustrates the risks involved in these early covert operations and the lengths they went to, both to execute them and to manage the fallout when things went wrong. It makes you think about the human cost of this kind of work during the Cold War.
It's a powerful reminder that behind all the intelligence gathering and spy games, there were real people with families and lives at stake. All right, let's jump ahead quite a few years to a secret message from November 1977. It's from The Hague and concerns a Willem Oltmans.
Right, Oltmans. This message highlights his activities. According to a sensitive source, Oltmans had scheduled a meeting with a Cuban ambassador in The Hague on October 3rd. During this meeting, Oltmans apparently mentioned he was heading to America on the 16th and confirmed his readiness to travel to Cuba at the beginning of November, as previously arranged.
So he was moving in some interesting circles.
It seems so. The message also notes that on the same day, October 3rd, Oltmans had also met with the Russian ambassador Romanov. It's like he was on a diplomatic tour. Interestingly, the memo points out that an earlier attempt by the Cuban ambassador to schedule a meeting with Oltmans during the week of September 25th had failed. Oltmans couldn't be reached because he was in the Soviet Union.
So in a short span, he's been to the USSR and has planned trips to both the US and Cuba. Why was the agency tracking him so closely?
The message explicitly states that Altman's, quote, continuing close contact with Cuban and Soviet diplomats and his recent travel to the USSR and apparent current travel to Cuba is of interest in view of his notorious role at the time of the death of George de Mohrenschildt.
George de Mohrenschildt. That name comes up a lot in JFK discussions. He was connected to Oswald, wasn't he?
He was. De Mohrenschildt was an intriguing character who had known Oswald during Oswald's time in Dallas. His death in 1977, ruled a suicide, occurred just before he was scheduled to testify before the House Select Committee on Assassinations, the HSCA. This timing, understandably, raised eyebrows. The memo specifically mentions that de Mohrenschildt was of interest to both the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and the HSCA.
So it's Altman's connection to de Mohrenschildt, especially around the time of his death, that's piquing the agency's interest, leading them to monitor his contacts with Cuban and Soviet officials.
It seems so. They were clearly keeping tabs on anyone with ties to key figures in the JFK story, even years later. The memo even concludes by saying that if headquarters approved, the station had no objections to sharing this information about Altman's with appropriate source protection, of course with the relevant congressional authorities. This shows their continued willingness to cooperate, at least to some extent, with the JFK assassination inquiries.
All right, let's move on to a secret message from Mexico City, dated March 1978. This message expresses some serious concerns about U.S. operations in Mexico City being compromised.
Yeah, this one's a bit tense. This message refers back to earlier cables that confirmed anxieties about operations targeting the Soviet presence in Mexico City. The main concern here revolves around an upcoming NBC television program. The Mexico City station believes this program will damage U.S. security interests in the agency in a number of ways.
What exactly are they worried about? What kind of damage?
They outline a number of potential repercussions. First, they're concerned that any revelation of sources by someone identified as back in the NBC program, even without names or descriptions, could confirm to the Soviets that a certain pattern of recruitment had been successful. They believe the KGB had managed to turn someone within every single rotation of Soviet officials serving in Mexico City.
So they're afraid that even vague revelations could lead the Soviets right to their sources.
Precisely. And that would have been disastrous. They also worry that future recruitment efforts would be exposed, regardless of the motive. They believe this exposure would immediately impact not only Mexico City, but also La Paz and Montevideo, and could potentially hinder recruitment efforts globally.
It's a domino effect.
Exactly. On top of that, the memo expresses concern that operational tradecraft and methods would be revealed, causing irreparable damage to their capabilities. The Mexico City station could become a liability. They also worry about damage to the relationship with the Mexican government, which, they emphasize, often provides unwitting assistance to their operations. The political fallout from this NBC program could jeopardize existing cooperation and future collaboration.
So they're worried about damaging their relationship with a key partner.
Absolutely. And they also anticipate significant damage to their existing source network. Current sources might stop collaborating for fear of exposure. There's also concern about embarrassing President López Portillo, who had recently traveled to Moscow. They believe the Soviets are likely to seize the opportunity to highlight what they would call unbridled CIA operations against them in Mexico.
So even if the Mexican president tries to downplay it, the damage is done.
Right. The Soviets would have used it to their advantage. The memo also mentions the local security environment for the station in Mexico City. They note that while the local press hadn't recently covered alleged CIA activities, the agency had been accused of orchestrating Kennedy's assassination through something called the option of Adolfo Toro. Sounds pretty wild. They fear that the NBC program would further fuel local propaganda against them, putting their personnel at risk.
And it seems like this Bach character is at the heart of their anxieties about these potential disclosures.
Absolutely. They believe Bach likely has a lot more information to reveal and could become a source for further unauthorized disclosures. He might even become a media sensation, which would only amplify the problem. The memo concludes with a request for more precise details regarding locations mentioned in prior communications and urgently requests guidance from headquarters on how to manage this situation. It really underscores the gravity of the situation from their perspective.
They sound like they're in damage control mode, trying to prevent a potential disaster. All right, let's look at a secret message from Brussels, dated May 1978. It's titled, W. Intel en Flair Negal, Flemish Order of Militants. This looks like it involves intelligence sharing with a European partner.
It does. This message details concerns that the U.S. raised with an allied intelligence service referred to as NITRUST, about the sharing of Nagal information with the House Select Committee on Assassinations, the HSCA. Nitrust apparently responded verbally, stating they wouldn't provide U.S. information about possible VNO-GVMO contacts to the HSCA. Their reasoning was that they believed the Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA, would put such information at risk, and they also feared that Congress might leak the sensitive Nagal information related to the VMO, which is likely another militant organization.
So Nitrust didn't want to share this intel because they were worried it would end up public.
Exactly. The U.S. side didn't feel reassured by this verbal response. They were waiting for a formal written response to their concerns. The message hints that the U.S. intelligence community suspected there was some posturing going on with Nitrust, a bit of reluctance to fully cooperate.
Playing hard to get, maybe.
Perhaps. The memo recalls only 2 prior instances of Nigel-U.S. discussions. The more recent one involved a connection between 2 VNOG individuals and some Americans in early 1977. This connection happened when the organization briefly met with an American Nazi Party member who had been expelled from the UK and had passed through Belgium. The U.S. had shared information about this incident with Nitrust at the time.
So there was a history of cooperation, but now there's this tension over sharing information with the HSCA.
It seems like they had different views on how trustworthy the HSCA was, how good they would be at keeping secrets. The U.S. ultimately concluded that there was no convincing Nitrust to change their stance. Despite being aware of the U.S. policy on protecting sources and methods, they remained skeptical about the U.S.'s ability to safeguard the sensitive information when dealing with the HSCA. The message ends with the U.S. offering to provide headquarters with specific details about FOIA regulations that could counter Nitrustees' arguments.
So they were trying to find common ground, a way to cooperate while addressing each other's concerns.
It's a classic case of trying to balance the need for intelligence, sharing with the absolute necessity of protecting sources and methods. Especially tricky when you've got international partners involved, each with their own perspectives on the risks.
Okay, let's look at another secret message from Mexico City, also from March 1978. This one concerns WN Intel Ribat Huaplash and appears to directly involve the HSCA.
This is where it gets real, huh?
It does. This message explicitly discusses the activities of the HSCA, chaired by Representative Louis Stokes. It reports that the committee had been interviewing several retired and former agency employees and had been going through the materials provided to them by the agency.
And through this process, they managed to uncover some sensitive information, didn't they?
They did. According to this memo, HSCA staff had obtained names of non-official cover, or NOC, officers, and even some agent cryptonyms. Furthermore, the committee was planning to send staff to various countries to interview individuals in the field.
That would definitely raise some alarm bells within the agency. Understandably so. The memo states that the agency was most concerned about the protection of sources and resources and the identities of their non-official officers. While they wanted to cooperate with the committee's investigation, they were determined to assess each request for overseas interviews on a case-by-case basis to minimize the risks.
So they were walking a tightrope, trying to help while protecting their assets.
Precisely. The memo mentions that the agency was working with Chairman Stokes to develop some ground rules for handling the HSCA's requests. For instance, contact info for former employees living abroad who were already known to the committee would be handed over, provided they weren't currently under non-official cover. For individuals who were not and had never been agents but might have relevant information, the agency would provide names to the HSCA, but only after verifying that those individuals were not and had never been under NOC.
What about current agents or NOCs?
Well, the agency drew a hard line there. They made it clear they would not reveal any information about current assets or operations. The guidelines stipulated that HSCA staff could interview NOCs, but those who weren't in the country where the interview was requested would be flown to other locations. Plus, they would use aliases during the interviews. Non-agents, past or present, could interview agents. And importantly, anyone approaching the field with a request from an HSCA staffer to connect them with NOCs or agents was instructed to immediately contact headquarters before agreeing to anything.
So lots of precautions to safeguard their people.
Absolutely. This memo offers a fascinating look into the complex interplay between congressional oversight and the intelligence community's need for secrecy. It's a theme we see over and over again in these files. Okay, lastly, there's a brief mention of a DDO notice from September 29, 1976.
Fill us in.
This notice outlines a restructuring of the staff structure within the Operations Directorate, effective October 1, 1976. It details the functions of various staff components within that directorate. It's basically an internal organizational matter and doesn't seem to directly relate to the JFK assassination.
All right, so as we wrap up this fifth deep dive into the JFK files, made possible in part by our partners at Bald and Bonkers Network, LLC, I have to ask, what are some of the key takeaways for you?
Well, what really stands out is the impact of the House Select Committee on Assassinations investigation in the late 1970s. We see it in their pursuit of leads in the MLK assassination, which had an international scope and required careful diplomacy. And we see it even more clearly in the agency's concerns about the HSCA's inquiries into their operations, both past and present. Protecting sources, methods, and NOC identities is a major theme.
It seems to be their top priority.
It is. The fact that they had to establish guidelines for cooperating with the HSCA really underscores the sensitivity of the information being sought. The agency was trying to balance oversight with their core mission of protecting national security.
And were there any specific details or contradictions that stood out to you, things that made you think twice?
The account of Operation Escalade in Havana is fascinating, even if it's not directly related to JFK. It gives us a glimpse into the operational environment of the Cold War, the risks involved in intelligence gathering. It helps us understand the agency's mindset leading up to 1963. The agency's interest in Willem Oltmans in 1977, because of his connection to de Mohrenschildt, also raises questions. It shows that they were still actively monitoring individuals linked to Oswald, even years after the assassination. There was a persistent unease, a sense that there were still loose ends to tie up.
So 100 files down, over 1,000 to go. What do you think, folks? What else might be hidden in those remaining JFK files? And why might that information still be considered sensitive after all these years? These are the questions that keep us going, keep us digging deeper. We're just getting started, and we hope you'll stick with us on this journey.